again, all right? So we have the same emotion.
Oh, no, I carry those things.
Perfect. So,
Brian, you want to do the warm up?
oh yeah, okay. So, all right, just take a few minutes, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and discuss with the people at your table. So maybe just 2 of you at the table, that's okay. Discuss at your table who taught you about how to understand the book of Revelation. So whether it was when you were a kid or recently, just who taught you about how to understand the book of Revelation. And note, each person is limited to 1 minute of talk time. How's it? Okay. And
Becky coming down? No. It's kind of reverse psychology for all the years I've was almost on the whole.
I just asked him to Richard if he can work involved in this. All right, I missed the question. What was there?
Nobody was there.
Yeah.
I've done lots and lots of Bible studies. No one taught me. Revelation refuses me. Every time I read it, well, yes, it is. All day.
For me, for most of my life, I was after the
There was the camel in
There's stuff in there that makes you
No,
think of helicopter.
no, if they're not here.
Yeah, and so. Or is it gonna hit the
Well, here's the thing,
universal
we'll have
money
I haven't
that we're gonna
personally
have to
always
so
been
that's
to
through the
the
law and
back
that.
left
The series like Tim
Yeah, behind it. See the movies
fiction, but
yeah. What's funny is Jerry Jenkins, the author that's with the yeah, mostly his local. But yeah, we kind of know them a little bit. Yeah. Kind of curious. Even in all that, though, I think this girl's up, like this just kind of accepted. So I'm kind of curious to see what the other 2 are.
Have you seen this yet?
And then there's the Allison.
Any discussion question? Hey, maybe the comments.
Hey, welcome to Bethany. You new here? Good morning, good morning.
That's good. That's good. I always hope that they will.
Hey, don't forget to get a welcome back before you leave today, okay?
That's not Mars, it's not Mars. Some people are saying that.
Oh, it's mostly
I think Brian's just trying to counterbalance things, you know.
I think a lot of it is
Counterbalance the heck preemptively.
Right. Quick. This is how I tend to show how you can disagree with things in a kind of that sort of
They're on the warm-up question, the table over there.
They're what?
They're on the warm-up
Yeah,
question.
okay, I think it's kind of the different viewpoints that go into it. I'm sure that I went to so today.
All right, hey, I'm going to call time on this. Would anyone be willing to share your experience with Revelation, who taught it to you, and the whole group here?
Derek will
Yes,
share.
Derek.
So for me, it was mostly just the pastor of whatever church I was at, like whether, growing up or military or college or whatever,
they would do, maybe a sermon on it or potentially a series on it. But there's that, and then I did do the year BSF where they went through Revelation, so that was really intriguing. I've never taken a real deep dive myself into it. Just, like daily devotional here or there would touch on it. But so I guess growing up, I've always been, all it's really been fed to me is the premillennialism. So I'm really curious to see what the other views are. And
Awesome.
that kind of thing.
Anyone else?
I too had a full year time of studying the book of Revelation with BSF.
Yeah.
What was your, if you don't mind me asking, what was your experience before that? Anything that stands out? or- Okay. Yeah.
Early in our married life, we attended prophecy conferences over at First Free that Moody Bible Institute put on. So every year they would put on a week-long prophecy conference with huge speakers, John Walker and big names in Christian advanced education. And so from there, I developed most of my views.
Okay. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I have a whole week dedicated.
You ever heard of it? You know if they took place?
I've heard I've heard of the prophecy conferences, but I've never been to one. And was it, how many years ago was it that they did that?
30 plus.
Okay. We
40
got
plus.
married 20,
Yeah, I mean, 30 plus is when we went. It probably started before. Is that Nancy back
is that
there?
back
Yes.
then?
Yeah, they might have gone on 50 years ago for all I know.
Okay.
But yet, that's when we started coming in from 35 years ago.
One more? Anyone else? Nancy, you look like you're.
Well, the only thing I could say is you can't I know I'm getting ahead of the game, but you can't isolate Revelation from all of Scripture. So over the course of the 6 weeks, I would hope that we would have the
Continuity, cohesiveness, charity, I don't know.
that too.
Unity. Yeah, I don't think we'll have uniformity, but we'll have unity.
There you go.
That's my goal. Yeah, so just real quick, I'm going to give an overview of how this is laid out and what we're going to do today. Then I have a quote, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brian. He's got the first couple of views. But to be clear, this has been an education for us as well. It was funny, we went into discussions with Pastor McTerry about doing something like this, and then you think you know what you know, and then you start studying, and you're like, wow, I didn't think I knew what I knew, but now I think I know. So we're going to try to share that with you. Let me also start by pointing you to the primary source material. Yes, the primary source material is the Bible, so let's get that joke out of the way. But this book is actually in our church library, so it's not some crazy book that Scott found on the internet. It's called Revelation, 4 Views, a Parallel Commentary by a man named Steve Gray. Phenomenal. If you have to do any study in Revelation, I highly recommend this book. Right now, this book is checked out of our church library, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so you can't find it right now here, but I highly recommend it.
So in 6 weeks.
Yeah. So, Nancy, actually your comment's perfect for leading into this quote from this book to start things off. Because I want to make sure, as Pastor Jerry talked about last week, that we're going into this with the right spirit. Like so much of what, sadly, I see as the dark side of Christian theological discussion, particularly online, is not one of charity and wanting to build others up towards Christ and toward a greater knowledge of His Word, but rather one of competition where we go in with our fist up and just start slugging it out. And if you know any, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of you, in your experience with end times studies, there were, to varying degrees, people who basically approach it that way. Like, here's my view. If I'm right, and if you don't hold this view, you're a heretic. Why? You're probably not a Christian. Like, there's a lot of people out there like that. But I'm going to go back to somebody I would imagine not many, if any of you have read. How many have read anything of Justin Martyr? All right. This will be new information for everyone. This was taken from this book. We do not have access to much that was written in the first 4 centuries of the church, and a large variety of interpretations may have been held for which no documentation has survived. Justin Martyr, a premillennialist, and we'll talk about the millennial, different millennial views after this week. Writing on this very subject left clear testimony to the presence in his day of alternative viewpoints in the church. In his dialogue with Trypho, Justin wrote, quote, "I am not so miserable a fellow, Trypho, as to say one thing and think another. I admitted to you formally that I and many others are of the opinion, premillennialism, and I signify to you that many who belong to the pure and pious faith are true Christians think otherwise. It is clear," unquote, "it is clear that there were many whom Justin regarded as true Christians and who belonged to the pure and pious faith who did not hold to his premillennialism." And that's something I want us to keep in the back of our minds. The views that you're going to see, you might be encountering these views for the very first time. But I promise you, they've been held by many for centuries. Many who we would rightly call our brothers and sisters in Christ. So I want us to keep that in mind. Now the outline, as you can see in your notes, we're going to walk through the 4 dominant views of Revelation. Now this is different than the views of the millennium, which was kind of the focus of this whole study, which again we'll get to after this week. But to get to that point, we really have to examine the lens that we look at Revelation through. And so first thing we're going to do, we're going to give you guys the basic definitions of the views. Then we're going to look at a passage, a very famous passage of Revelation, and analyze it through the lens of each of those 4 views. Then, and Mr. Erickson, I hope this is teaching gold in your view, we're going to pass a passage from Revelation off to you guys in your groups. And you guys are going to analyze it and try to come up with what each of those lenses would say about that particular passage. And with any time that remains, we have a little bit of opportunity for discussion. So, any questions before we get going? Brian, which 2 views are you starting with?
Okay, so I'm going to go over the Futurist and the Preterist, which obviously are the first 2 on your form. And I think we'll go through the description brief on Futurist, and then I'll just go into a little brief history of what Futurist, how it came about. So number 1 on your sheet, Futurist. So the view that the majority of the prophecies of the book of Revelation have never yet been fulfilled and await future fulfillment. Futurist interpreted.
Oh, hold on. First blank, future.
Oh yeah.
First blank, future.
I think they've got it blank on it.
Oh, I know, but putting on my.
That was my dramatic pause.
Putting on my being
wait
observed
a
hat.
couple seconds of future.
Bravo.
Futurist interpreters usually apply everything after chapter 4 to a relatively brief period before the return of Christ. Okay, so the futurist view, and I think you've alluded to this already, but so the 4 views that we're going over today, Futurist, Preterist, Historicist, and Spiritualist, out of these 4 views is where we get the millennial views, so the premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial. So futurist, the futurist view potentially goes back to some of the early church fathers. Papias, he's not a fruit, Papias, Bishop of Phrygian Hierapolis, interpreted the millennium as a future golden age on earth. His ideas were also followed by several other church fathers. The futurist view could also go back as late as the 1500s. The reformers began to view the Roman papacy, okay, so the Catholic Church, as the first beast in Revelation. That's right. It was this element that galvanized the reformers in their resistance to Rome. So coming to the defense of the papacy, the Catholic Church, was a Spanish Jesuit named Francisco Rivera. Francisco. That's a fun name to say. Anybody seen Elf?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, thank you. Otherwise that joke sounded kind of weird. That's one of the guy's name. So Francisco Rivera, he presented an alternative to the historicism of the reformers. He taught that John was really talking about the near future and then the final things at the end of the world. The Antichrist was defined to arise in the end times, and Babylon was seen as Rome, but a futuristic corrupted state, Rome. This was the beginning of many of the ideas in the Futurist approach to Revelation. For approximately 2 centuries, Protestants have regarded futurism as a product of the papacy's self-defense against the claims of the reformers. But it was renewed in the 19th and 20th centuries by the Plymouth Brethren and the Bible Church movement. The official entrance of the Futurist approach to Revelation into Protestant circles came through Samuel R. Maitland, and he was a librarian to the Archbishop of Canterbury around 1827. And then the Plymouth Brethren leader John Nelson Darby then incorporated it into his dispensational theology, which he is most remembered. The best known version of Futurism today is that of dispensational theology. Dispensationalists would place the rapture of the church at Revelation 4:1, where other futurists would place it later. And some of the famous names in the dispensational camp would include Hal Lindsey, J.N. Darby, I guess initial John Nelson Darby, C.I. Schofield, Clarence Larkin, Charles Ryrie, John Walford, and many others. Thank you. So that's kind of just a brief synopsis of Futurist. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I would imagine that most of you, if your experience in understanding Revelation comes from a pastor that you've had over the last 50 years, that's the view they hold. That's the view they hold. So.
In an evangelical church.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, and just a little side note too. That's pretty much what I grew up with. In fact, when I was a young kid, I think Thief in the Night. Is everybody familiar with that film?
Oh, yeah.
Thief in the Night. Yeah, there's like 4 of them, and I remember as a kid watching that. And I think about the second one. It ends where the guillotine's coming down, and it ends, and it gave me nightmares. I mean, it scared me. So, and that's pretty much that's. I didn't until I was in high school and I had the Left Behind books. I was at a friend's house and their dad, he's not a pre-mill, and I was going over the Left Behind books, and he goes, "Hey, check this out," and he pointed out a passage in the Bible, and then I think it's where Jesus is talking about where the carcasses. What passage was it? I think it's during the Alva Discourse, and he pointed out. He said something, but it was the first time I had ever heard anyone say anything other than a rapture, pre-trib, and actually he might have been pre-mill. You know what? He could have been like post-trib or something like that.
Well, let's not get too far.
Yeah, let's not. Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. Okay, all right. Preterist. The view that sees the fulfillment of Revelation's prophecy as already having occurred in what is now the ancient past. That's the first point. Not long after the author's own time. Thus the fulfillment was in the future from the point of view of the inspired author, but it is in the past from our vantage point in history. Some preterists believe that the final chapter of Revelation looked forward to the second coming of Christ. Oh, sorry. The second blank was future. So fulfillment was in the future from the point of view of the inspired author. And then the last blank, forward. Okay. So the preterist approach. So fulfillment is in the past, shortly after the time of writing. Those who hold to the classical preterism of centuries past take a high view of the inspiration of Scripture and the date of the book of Revelation prior to AD 70. They believe much of the book was fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem. In this view, the book only has such value to modern readers as does any fulfilled prophecy in the Bible. So, for example, prophecies that have been fulfilled in the Old Testament. But to the early readers who were enduring persecution from the Jews at the time, it served as a promise of soon deliverance and the vindication of those who died as martyrs. So the preterist view, it has the advantage of immediate relevance to the original readers, a feature we would strongly expect to find in the epistle. It also is the only view that does not need an alternative to the literal sense of passages like Revelation 1:1 and verse 19, which affirm that the events predicted, quote unquote, must shortly come to pass, and quote unquote are about to take place. And like Revelation 22:10, where John is told not to seal up the book because quote unquote the time is at hand, which is actually a contrast to the book of Daniel, because Daniel in 12:9 was told to quote unquote seal up the book because it would not be immediately fulfilled. Some non-preterists would say that these arguments actually are a degree of stretching and even desperation in such passages. Another selling point for preterism is that the prophecies in Revelation exhibit many points of correspondence with the fall of Jerusalem as recorded in awful detail by the eyewitness historian Flavius Josephus. Anybody ever heard of him?
Oh, yeah.
Josephus? Okay.
I got a book at home,
Okay.
written by him.
First edition?
Is it signed?
First, is it autographed? Did he sign
No.
it? No?
My dad's signature is in it.
Okay.
That's valuable.
That's vital. Okay. The Olivet Discourse is told in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you're not, when you hear Olivet Discourse, it's the scene where the disciples ask Jesus about the temple, and then Jesus goes into like a whole message. I think it's a couple chapters about what's going to basically happen, and the interpretation.
The end of the age,
Yeah,
I believe.
so
is the phrase.
and that's a passage that has been discussed. Some will say, it's the future. Some will say it was about the fall of Jerusalem AD. And some, off track. Some have suggested that Revelation is John's expanded version of the Olivet Discourse. Much of the Olivet Discourse was given in response to the disciples' question concerning the timing of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Preterists believe that this and the book of Revelation are both talking about Jerusalem's destruction in AD. So a couple problems with preterism have been said. It's heavy dependence on the pre-AD 80-70 date of writing. It's defensible but not undisputed. And also, some of its alleged roots go back to a man named he's a Jesuit, Louis de Alcazar, who, along with potentially Futurism, formulated preterism to refute the Reformers' Historicist View, like we were talking about earlier with Futurist against the Catholic Church. Some historical support for preterism. There was a church historian, Eusebius. After reviewing some of Josephus' description of the destruction of Jerusalem, just made a comparison that most likely Jesus' words in Matthew 24:19 and 21 was being fulfilled, what Josephus wrote. Let's see, and there's been a recent resurgence of some of the preterist views, and some of the modern day pastors and authors, Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, and Douglas Wilson, and just to name a few. But yeah, and I guess a big nutshell, that's preterism. So, yeah.
Okay, there we go. So futurist and preterism. Has anyone heard of the term preterism before, just out of curiosity? Okay. So, Brian and I decided ahead of time, we're going to do our level best not to forecast where we stand with regards to these views, so hopefully,
Does everybody have
we're doing this as unbiased as we can. The first view I'm going to explain is the Historicist View. The Historicist View. Let's fill in the blanks here. This view sees the book of Revelation as a pre-written record of the course of history. First blank, history. From the time of the apostles to the end of the world. Fulfillment is thus considered to be in progress. Second blank, progress. At present, and has been unfolding for the last 2,000 years. Historicists often view the Pope as the Antichrist. Antichrist, yes.
I even had a sound effect and everything.
Yeah.
A moving target then.
Yeah.
At the Pope change, the end.
Because this is being recorded, let the record show, as one who grew up Catholic, I do not hold this view.
What do they say that for? What's their view? Why do they say that?
Well, that's a good question. That kind of gets into the history of. Kenneth, did somebody ask you to ask that question?
No, because there's always a reason why people do that.
Absolutely. So to give a little bit of a history real quick. Number one, the roots of the historicist view go back to the 12th century. And that would make sense. They take a very hostile view towards the Church of Rome, towards the Pope. And it took some time after the apostles for that church to kind of establish itself and really take on the political and spiritual power that it had in Europe. So we see the roots of historicism going back to the 12th century. Then there's this little guy who came along named Martin Luther. Has anyone heard of Martin Luther?
Oh, yeah.
Let me read you a little bit about him here. Martin Luther was one of the first commentators to see Revelation from chapter 4 onwards as a prophetic survey of church history. The particulars of John Calvin's interpretation are not known, since Revelation is the only New Testament book upon which he did not produce a commentary. However, Luther's general approach to Revelation was followed by virtually all of the reformers, by Protestants well into the 19th century. So if Pastor Jerry were here, I'm sure when Brian was talking about the Futurists, he would have said something about, yeah, if you look at the early church fathers, you know, from the time of the apostles up till about the 2nd, 3rd century, they were, for the most part, Futurists. Now, I would push back on him and say, well, we don't have a whole lot of source material from that time, which is why I use that Justin Martyr quote, but I would then stack up the following people against him in favor of the historicist view if we're going to weigh people of importance through church history. Maybe you've heard of these men who hold this view, and I'll get you a count in a second. People who held the historicist view: John Wycliffe, John Knox, William Tyndale, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, Sir Isaac Newton, John Hus, John Fox, John Wesley, John Edwards, George Whitefield, Charles Finney, Spurgeon, Matthew Henry, Adam Clark, no relation, Albert Barnes, E.B. Eliot, and a handful of others that I'm not super familiar with. So this is a pretty common view. Now, Kenneth, to your question.
Okay, this is not somewhere. How can they say that the Pope is the Antichrist when there's been so many popes over the years?
I think two things, and without being an expert on the matter, this is as much as I can give you. Number one, you got to think back into history of the political power that the church in Rome had in the Middle Ages. Like, it wasn't just like we think of the Pope today. Like, he had an army. He was out there waging war and making alliances with different kingdoms. So there was very much a sword, if you will, that the church in Rome had, in addition to just the theological power. But then I think the second thing, for those of you who, if you've ever like read or Martin Luther's Here I Stand speech, has anyone read that before? If you haven't, if you want to hear somebody who gives a speech with conviction and understanding the full consequences of what he was saying, you listen to that speech. It will inspire you to step it up in your Protestant game. But anyway, you got to understand those reformers, they were very much on the chopping block from the perspective of Rome. So, like all of us, as we look at the world, as we look at Scripture, we see it through a lens that is influenced in part by the culture that we're in. And I would argue, Kenneth, to your point, that for Martin Luther, when the Church of Rome was calling for his death, it makes it a little bit easier to look at the Pope through this lens. So if
It's always been a good strategy to demonize the enemy.
Absolutely. Especially when the enemy's trying to kill you.
Yeah.
So I would just say this, if you want an oversimplified view of the historicist view, the Roman Catholic Church is the beast in Revelation, and the Pope is the Antichrist. Like, that's pretty much it. Now, how many of you have heard of someone holding that view today? Like, it's really fallen off the wayside, and I would argue rightfully so. But, yeah, I'll leave it at that in the risk of talking.
It's also important to note that the reformers were anti-Catholic, whether it was right or wrong to be anti-Catholic.
Yeah.
They were going to be Anti-Catholic, to the death.
Well, and it's funny, I mean, to say anti-Catholic might be stretching it too far, because there were a number of elements of Catholicism Luther held to.
I understand.
Yeah. So, but nonetheless.
Well, and that's, and actually what you just said there too, in one of the Jesuits, I forgot the guys that I read earlier, but yeah, the Futurists and Preterists actually, one of the things that one of the guys came up with as a response to people that said the Pope was the Antichrist was to say, no, what they're talking about Revelation actually referred to a future, not modern day.
Not the Pope today.
Right, not the Pope today, it's someone else. But I did talk to a guy, it's probably 20 years ago, when I was in Wisconsin. There was a group of, I guess we call them street preachers. They would go out on Friday night and, God love them. They had just had a unique way of spreading the gospel. And I remember talking to him in conversation, and he said with a straight face, oh yeah, the Pope is the Antichrist. So there are people that do believe that. But yeah, it's not a common view.
Yeah, and I should say, I said earlier, I'm trying not to communicate what our views are.
Right.
I will tip my hand. We don't hold this view. So just, that's the one view you can safely say we don't hold. So let's move on to the next one in the interest of time. The spiritualist view. The spiritualist view. This view does not attempt to find individual fulfillment. First blank, fulfillment of the visions, but takes revelation to a great drama depicting transcendent, second blank, spiritual realities, i.e. representing good versus evil. Fulfillment is seen either as entirely spiritual or as recurrent, finding representative expression in historical events throughout the age, rather than in one-time specific fulfillments. One time is the last blank. One time specific fulfillments. It's interesting, Greg in his book talks about how the spiritualist view has kind of had like popcorn, like evolution, like popping up here or there throughout most of church history. I guess the one thing I want to say, and I thought this was important, there's a number. The spiritualist view is the description that Steve Gregg uses. If you talk to somebody who functionally holds this view, they might not use that word. They might call themselves an idealist. They might call themselves a non-literal allegorical person. They might call themselves a symbolic poetic interpreter. So this is Steve Gregg's general description of kind of a catch-all for a lot of people who see Revelation, for lack of a better way to describe it, more as an allegory. Anyway, one thing I want to read, because I think there is a logical temptation for us here, quoting Steve Gregg, though this kind of spiritualizing approach is sometimes associated with theological liberalism, it is entirely consistent with a high view of inspiration of Scripture. And there are many commentaries by theological conservatives who believe that John had the visions revealed to him exactly as he claims, but who believe that their meaning is to be spiritually understood in a sense that would be edifying to believers of any age. So I know my instinctive thought when I first started studying this was like, yeah, this is basically like what liberal theologians want. You know, it's like, hey, the whole Bible's an allegory and it's just describing good and evil. But be careful not to put people automatically into that category, because historically there are many people in church history who have a very high view of Scripture, who view it, with the exception of Revelation, basically in the same terms that we do, but who take the spiritualist approach. So, comments, questions? Yes?
I think it's interesting to note that I've definitely listened to people who have like combinations of these views. And because I'm reading those and I'm like, oh, I remember hearing a guy talk about that. I'm like, oh, but he also talked about that. And so I think
they're not nice, neat camps, I will say that. So if you find yourself listening to this and thinking, man, I kind of fall into like 30% here and 40% there, like, you're not alone. But
They kind of bleed together.
they do bleed together. Okay, page 2. So I thought it would be good to look at a passage from Revelation that everyone is familiar with, and talk about how each of these views would interpret it. Okay. The first passage, there's a lot contained in here, so just please understand this is an overview, not an exhaustive survey. Is Revelation chapter 11, and specifically verses 1 through 14. Can I get a volunteer to read Revelation 11, verses 1 through 14? Oh, go for it, Natalie.
And there was given to me a measuring rod. Side note, I just read the whole exhaustive section in Ezekiel with a measuring rod. Wow. Okay.
Hold on, I'm going to pump the brakes there. Just keep in mind, there's a lot of Old Testament imagery in Revelation. Keep going, keep going.
There was given to me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. And leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations. And they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone desires to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone would desire to harm them in this manner, he must be killed. These have the power to shut up the sky in order that rain may not fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to smite the earth with every plague as often as they desire. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. And those from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days, and will not permit their dead bodies to be laid in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry, and they will send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. And after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God came into them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell upon those who were beholding them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up into heaven in the cloud, and their enemies beheld them. And in that hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. And 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and after reading that, I mean, honestly, it is kind of hard to believe that you wouldn't just take that at face value, and because you know what, honestly, that could very well be the truth. Is exactly what's going to happen the way it just said. However, we have our 4 views, and we're gonna go through it and just see, okay, what would a futurist say? What would a preterist say? What would a historist say? What would a spiritualist say about that? So your first section there, futurist. So based on a futurist view of this, the 1,260 days refer either to a period of a literal 3.5 years at the end of tribulation, or to 2 different periods of that length totaling 7 years. I think growing up, I've always heard 7 years. The 2 witnesses are 2 individual prophets yet to appear in Jerusalem, possibly. Actually, anybody have an idea what that would be? Moses. Yep. And how about the second one? I think what they came up with was Enoch. Yep, Enoch and Elijah. Alternatively, they may represent a larger witnessing body. Okay, so that would be a futurist interpretation of that passage. Preterists might say the 1,260 days is the period of the Jewish war of. Anybody have an idea? What? Nero. So Nero was the Caesar preterist would be talking about. Nero's persecution or
Natalie, ESV, read what version?
NASB.
NASB, thank you. Sorry.
That's right.
The only authorized version.
Wow. One in every crowd. Hey, say that in King James only church. The 2 witnesses are either historic prophetic witnesses against the Jews prior to the downfall of Jerusalem, or a representation of the civil and religious authority in Israel. So that's just and I think Scott already alluded to this, that the descriptions we're giving here is based of this 4 views of Revelation that we're using. So, all right, so that's gonna.
Yeah, and to piggyback off what Brian said, those are just the 2 general summary points from those views. Like, there's a lot contained in that passage that we don't have time to get into. So I know Brian has notes and I have notes in case anyone has a burning desire to know some of the other details from the particular views. So if we get time at the end, we'll go there. The Historicist View. By the time I get done talking about the Historicist View, you'll be able to do the Historicist View on your own pretty easily. The 1,260 days is actually 1,260 years, being the duration of the power of the papal, P-A-P-A-L, papal Rome. Next, under the Historicist View, the 2 witnesses represent Waldenese, Albigenese, I'm probably pronouncing those wrong, and others who resisted the papacy in the years before the Reformation. So, basically, if you want to say way to describe the lens of the Historicist View. Again, the Roman Church is the beast, and the Pope is the... Yeah, you got it. So, although I will say this, it's easy to kind of like make, kind of light of this view, but as I was studying this, as one who's not an expert on church history, I did find associating different parts of church history with the book of Revelation did help some of it stand out to a greater degree than it ever had before. So as far as a studying technique, that might be where the strength of the Historicist View is. Anyway, then the Spiritualist View. How does the Spiritualist analyze the 1,260 days and 2 witnesses? Again, it's a broad generalization. The 1,260 days symbolize the entire church age. Again, not all altogether different than the historicists, but we'll leave it at that. Then, the 2 witnesses are the church throughout the church age. The 2 witnesses are the church throughout the church age. Okay, I know that was, again, a broad oversimplification, but I think with the broad strokes, you kind of have a little bit of an idea of how these views look at things. And I'm sure some of you, who have been to prophecy conferences, I'm sure you're looking at the Futurist View and you're thinking, wait a minute, there's a whole lot more packed into that passage that you didn't talk about. Yes, and unless you want to stay here until like 11:30, we're going to just keep it in broad strokes.
11:30 at night.
Yeah, exactly. So, now that you're experts, let's have you guys at your tables put these lenses to the test as far as you can understand them. I would like us to read, can I get a different volunteer this time to read from Revelation 13 this time? And just 3 verses 16, 17, and 18. Another verse that many will be familiar with. Mrs. Van Wert, go.
Wait, let me make sure. 16 through 18?
Yes.
Okay. And he causes all the small and the great and the rich and the poor and the free men and the slaves to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666.
Very good. Let's take 5-7 minutes. See if you can analyze that passage from each of the perspectives, and if you need to join tables together, that's fine, but work as a team here.
I just said all.
Cooperative.
Well, I feel like I would have to do all sorts of historical research. I know, this is pretty specific. Okay, but historians seems like they use one time. And so like, I don't know, it's not, well, I feel like, schools, I'm very bad, I have to I don't know, like, I don't know, like, solid, I don't know, I know, like, I watch a lot of historical, like, and I know that there was a lot of, but I don't know if that refers to this exactly. I don't know. Anyways,
You guys are joined together? Or? Not too bad. I think you can probably do the historicist pretty easily. 666. In this view, and have started passing out.
accurate that what, but that's what comes to mind.
I tried to make it simple and good, but sometimes it works out in my head, doesn't play out like
by the limiting what you were allowed to do.
Well, the future view is actually.
Yeah, I know. Listen, I felt the same way.
Well, and it would come back to throwing some power out.
Don't worry.
It's been
I think it's hard to read it.
Then usually you have like
some type of.
yeah, so I'm saying they would do it early.
Everything happened, it happened soon after 22, except for
You have to be a member.
Right, it's basically,
For the chips that are in
you know, to be advanced in society, you have to have that mark.
So yeah, I mean, just like, the end of the world is coming, and it's starting.
Oh, you mean, of time?
That's, I think that's why everybody is saying. That idea that carries with and every generation is wrong. There'll be generations right at some point, but every generation is wrong.
So you're seeing the end of the world here now?
Yeah.
Jimmy, that goes back to the therefore, you know, the games they were playing.
Oh, I was looking up at that.
Yeah. So this is just like, yeah, you'll have to, have the corrections.
we're also telling you it doesn't work.
That's just not what I think. It don't make any sense to me.
Let's do that. Just beer.
Oh, great. Well, we got two.
I don't know if I have
Yeah, you were.
It's a cool story, something's gonna happen.
Just like you.
Yeah. The answer keys? Yep. I could have come up with that on my own. Let me just make that clear. So.
We can agree to it.
It's already done.
God says not to take it.
I mean, I think of like historic. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I think of like.
No, I don't think so.
Looking at all that makes me think
I would assume that's correct.
Yes.
Well, directionally that probably works.
Does that have a spelling? The dangers of having a math teacher type stuff up. So, good catch, Mr. Erickson. Good catch.
You know what? I saw that. I was thinking like the best
Is yet
the best person was Emperor. I didn't.
All right, folks. I'm gonna get everyone's attention real quick. Yeah, in the interest of time, we're going to cut this activity woefully short. Like any good student, props to Mr. Erickson. He caught a typo in the answer key. Did anyone else find it? Oh, Mrs. Erickson?
She's the one that got it.
Mrs. Erickson?
I'm just her voice.
In the preterist column, the second word.
Beast.
It should be beast, yes. Brian, that was a typo on your part trying to communicate anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah, D-E-A-S-T. Helps when the secretary who's typing is not a math teacher and can barely spell his own name, which is 5 letters long. Anyway, in the interest of time here, we're not going to go through all of these. I want to have just a few minutes at the end for discussion on the concluding question. But in the limited time that you had at your table and after seeing the answers, was there anything that stood out to you? Anything that stood out? Oh, yes.
It was several months ago that I went into a facility, went to buy some things, and they refused to take my cash or check.
Oh.
It had to be a credit card.
Brian and I were talking about that concept on Saturday when we were preparing this. As one who doesn't fall into the futurist camp, that reality that you're describing is the one thing I can't get my head around. Like, I think that's one of the stronger pieces of evidence for the futurist view. Historically, I also remember reading a couple of places that when Social Security numbers came out, they were saying the same thing. Like, I can't get any credit from any bank without giving them this number of mine. So, and obviously there were church fathers centuries ago who held, who thought as you do with regards to differing things, but
that's good.
It's a powerful piece of evidence towards the futurist view. Yeah. Yeah.
I've also, if you go on a toll place in the state of Illinois, it's cashless as well.
Easy pass.
Yep. Yep.
Our cars now carry the mark. Because our cars go under, it goes deep. See? Sorry.
But that's true, they will bill you. They will bill you to pass,
I
they
don't know.
won't take your money.
I think you're doing fine.
Thank you.
I see the pictures in the history.
No.
No, that's easy to see.
Right.
Without specifically naming parties in the future.
I was gonna say, that's too far, no, it isn't.
Yeah, and honestly, even a lot of these church fathers kind of went back and forth between the two. I will be curious, Jeff, after we get through each of us presenting our views on the millennium, if you find that you're in that type of camp where you're kind of split between two, or if you gravitate more towards one or the other, because those three views of the millennium do kind of naturally line up with certain views of the book of Revelation as a whole. So, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I got two part questions.
Yeah.
One, it says here that the Antichrist will control all money issues, correct? That am I reading that in
Yeah.
the
Are you,
views?
Kenneth? Are you looking at a particular view, or are you just saying in general?
No, just in the Futurist View.
Okay. Yeah.
And we talked about earlier about the Catholic Pope being the Antichrist. So my question, if you know this or not, or if you heard about it, or anybody have heard about this, how is it Pope or the Catholic controlling the money aspect of in today's society today?
Yeah, probably not. I don't think nowadays, and then like we said before, the Pope being viewed as the Antichrist is not a very popular view.
I'm just trying to ask a question about how they going to.
I would say, as best as you can, step back in time about 600, 700, 800 years, where the Pope again had actual political power in Europe. If Pastor Jerry were here, what he would say is one of the fundamental problems with the Historicist view is that it's very Eurocentric. Like, it just looks exclusively at Europe because that's where the manifestation of the church was at that time. It does not take into account the rest of the world. So I think that's how they came to that conclusion. Yeah, the next one.
Second question is, in all these views here, has the pandemic into the right now, is that with the pandemic we're going through right now, because of the cashless society what we're in now, is due to the pandemic. So does that have any weight with future events happening
It
or
could.
stuff like that?
It could. It's kind of, I think it's kind of one of those things that, you know, I'm sure like, there's guys out there, I'm sure that there's a show on AFR interpreting the times with Janet Markell. Anyone heard of it? Did I say it right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's always on after work, and I think I heard him the other day even talking about that potentially. So in the Futurist View, there are people today that know a lot and would talk about that same thing. So I think yeah, potentially.
Well, the futurist has to be looking at current events
Yes.
and trying to fit them in, or else his view starts to implode.
Yeah.
So he's got to look at, see, this, you know.
Yeah.
So it's almost, you know, you're looking for it under every rock and you find it.
I know Janet Partials will often call it like newspaper eschatology. Having the book of Revelation in one hand, having a newspaper in the other, and then matching them up. I think a lot of the criticism of the historicist view could also be applied in that particular case in the futurist view. So, Ken, to simple answer, a lot of people view it as evidence of prophecy, fulfillment, and revelation, for sure. I would argue they're almost exclusively all in the futurist camp. So, which camp do you fall in? You know, and I think, you know, as we get to talking about the millennium, you know, that might cause a shifting of your lens that you're using, because...
Well, the whole invention of the internet allowed us to be able to see, well, how could somebody in one place be heard all around the world?
Yeah.
Well, we couldn't even conceive that, let alone...
Well,
now it's like, oh,
there
now
were
I see
pastors
it,
and
that's
Bible-
right, it's going to happen that
There were
way.
pastors and Bible teachers in the 19th century, though, that were saying that same thing with regard to the telegraph. Like, we can get information electronically all over. So, yeah, it manifests itself, but I would agree with you today, it's more manifest than ever before.
We got one final.
Yeah, Mrs. Carl? Yes.
I'm just curious what the lesson is next week about the millennium.
Oh, we'll get there. Look on page 3, we'll get there. She's asking about next week, so that's on the next page. Yeah.
Thank goodness for Alcohol. Jump back to the whole internet telegraph, people hearing around the world. I've always marveled at the fact that Moses could address millions of people.
Good voice, good voice.
So, you know, God's got it figured out.
He does, and I apologize. Well, on behalf of Brian and I apologize if any of you were showing up today expecting us to give you definitive answers on, you know, how the pandemic relates to end times, how the forthcoming cashless society relates to end times. Pastor Jerry's really the guy you want to talk to get those answers, because he is in a different camp, I think, than Brian and I. But again, without tipping our hand too much, you just have to come back to kind of hear where we shake out with regards to things.
Okay, next week.
Well, hold on, real quick. In closing, we're past our time, but since when does that ever stop the teacher?
The bell.
Page 3. We don't have a bell. Thank the good Lord. Page 3. What view did you hold coming into this? Did today's lesson reinforce your view? Did it move you towards a different view? I don't know that we have time for everyone to give their answer to that, but I would be curious as you're thinking about this, especially over the course of this upcoming week as we go through the rest of the study. How has your view shifted? You know, you might find that it's reinforced where you stand, and that's fine. But I know, yeah, that's what's done for me. I'll be honest with you. So I'll be curious to hear if anyone has shifted at all in their view. Allison, I'll turn it over to you quickly to give a quick preview since you'll be teaching next week, and then if anyone wants to share an answer to that last question, we can close it down with that. So no pressure.
Yeah, I didn't know I was supposed to give a preview.
I blame Mrs. Carl.
It's going to be on an additional view of Revelation. No, I made that joke last week. It's not an additional view of Revelation at all. It'll be a little bit lighter, but in my opinion, still very interesting. It's going to be about where we see Jesus in the Proverbs.
Cool.
You're familiar with where Jesus occurs in the Proverbs, but he's all through it, and I think it's interesting. Hopefully you do too. hopefully you have a lot to say. If not, it'll be a short class, but I'm prepared to
I have
interact.
never seen Jesus there, so.
All
I
right.
thought you guys did a nice job of presenting all four views, and I actually saw what I would consider biblical evidence for each one, even though I might hold to one or the other.
Yeah.
I thought the preterist view was the newest to me in my thought. And when you gave the verses that talked about things are happening at hand and stuff like that, you know, I find it interesting when people call that argument slim, because, you know, it's clearly there. Because the verse I wrote down literally before you mentioned those was, I've always struggled with that verse that talks about, and you shall see these things happen before you shall pass away, kind of thing, talking about a human.
I think that's Matthew 24.
Talking about a human, not about Jesus.
Yeah. We're talking
But we're talking about a human life passing, that you're going to see this come to pass. And so it's kind of like, well, if that's not literal, then it must be spiritual. But I've always wondered about. But a preterist view would allow for that.
Yeah, there's a gentleman by the name of Doug Wilson. He debated a very popular atheist, Christopher Hitchens. Am I say his name right? Sure. Well, anyway, Christopher
You're making
Hitchens.
these names up.
Yeah, but the atheist, his argument pointed out those phrases that Jesus said, and basically pointed out that the Bible was not true, because he was saying, see, Jesus said these things would shortly take place, and it didn't happen. And Douglas Wilson he's a preterist,
Right.
and he says, well, actually, what I believe Jesus was talking about was something that was going to happen. And I guess it caught him so off guard that I wouldn't say he was speechless, but he had never, I guess, debated a Christian that had another view that was different. He said,
We're not going to get into that because obviously Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, is not in Revelation. But this book was the book that kind of got me thinking in a different track, and it weighs heavily on that passage you're talking about. Because like what Brian was saying is true. There's a lot of atheists who point to that and say, see, Jesus was a false prophet. He said this generation. Now there's a lot of explanations, but part of Brian's defense of the millennial view that he holds and the millennial defense that I will give of the view I hold gives very good answers, and I would argue the best ones to that. And just to reassure everyone, Jesus was not a false prophet. So, just,
I know, like we said before, everyone, it's like a melting pot, so there might be somebody that's futurist but partly preterist. There might be someone that's historicist, but you know what, I got a little futurist take on it too. And so that is kind of the fun of this, is realizing that, you know what, there's many interpretations, but you know, in the end, Jesus comes back at the end of all of them. You know, so
What's the real value?
so it's kind of a how do I say just a give and take. You know, it's fun to discuss it, but we're trying to demonstrate that, you know what, these are good in-church discussions, and we should have in-depth Bible studies. But at the end of the day, we shake hands and walk away and just say, hey, this is the Bible. There's different views, and we're going to respect each other's views and love each other as brothers and sisters.
dig into Scripture. Okay, time has passed. Thanks for being here. Come back for a better teacher next week.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Yay, our pleasure.